Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Good, good, okay. All right, welcome. My name is Daniel Martinez HoSang. I'm really pleased to be with you here for our session, Intersectionality at 30 States of Emergence. And I'm going to say a few very quick words to set the context for our discussion, then I'll introduce our panelists. Next year marks the 30th anniversary of the publication of a landmark article in Critical Race Studies, Legal Theory, and Feminist Scholarship, Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw's Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics, which first appeared in the University of Chicago Legal Forum in early 1989. That article, together with Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color in the Stanford Law Review, which came out a few years later, formed an early corpus of an analytic framework and a body of knowledge that we now know today as intersectionality. And with all the problematics and politics of citation measures aside, I should just mention that these two articles together have been cited nearly 25,000 times in the last 3 decades. We've asked our panelists today, whom I'll introduce in a moment, to talk about the particular ways that intersectionality has animated and shaped their respective research and advocacy work. That is, what kind of work intersectionality does for them. But I first want to make a couple of very quick points about Crenshaw's Mapping the Margins article as one point of entry. In the late 1980s, as the article was in formation, most of the advocacy and litigation around anti-discrimination and race and gender justice focused on the most visible opponents of such claims, the Reagan and Bush administrations generally, the reactionary turn of the Rehnquist court, and the rising tide of race and gender blindness as the default position of fairness in public life. Crenshaw's piece understood all of these forces, of course, but the article trained its focus not on these figures, but actually on the anti-racist and feminist legal and political strategies that were generated in opposition. Examining several employment law cases, she addressed their failures to both adequately understand and represent the experiences of Black women in these contexts, and to understand the ways race and gender-based subordination operated in general. These dominant strategies she demonstrated, which foregrounded the experiences of Black men and white women, respectively, with regards to race and gender justice, created, quote, a distorted analysis of racism and sexism because the operative conceptions of race and sex became grounded in experiences that actually represent only a subset of a much more complex phenomenon. This mattered both because of the ways it foreclosed the telling of Black women's experiences, but it also diminished the possibility that workers might, in her words, quote, accept the possibility that there is more to gain by collectively challenging the hierarchy rather than by each discriminatee individually seeking to protect her source of privilege within the hierarchy. It was in this way an analysis of the specific conditions facing Black women in the workplace in particular, and a more general call to address profound gaps in feminist and anti-racist political and advocacy strategies. Put another way, the problem is not just them, it's us too. This has been a hallmark of Crenshaw's work in particular, and theorizations of intersectionality in general. What are we getting wrong? What assumptions do we have to revisit? What else might be possible? These are some of the questions we're here to think about together today, and in particular with this amazing group of panelists who I'll now introduce. Tricia Rose is the Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies, Associate Dean of the Faculty for Special Initiatives, and Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. Professor Rose specializes in 20th century African American culture and politics, social thought, popular culture, and gender issues, really thinking especially about the contours, traditions, and possibilities of Black feminist cultural politics and practices. She's the author of several books that have been deeply influential to the scholarship produced within American studies, including Black Noise, Rap Music and Black Culture in Contemporary America, Longing to Tell, Black Women Talk About Sexuality and Intimacy, and the Hip Hop Wars, What We Talk About When We Talk About Hip Hop and Why It Matters. Next, we have Ezra Young, a nationally recognized civil rights attorney based in New York City. Young's work centers on trans rights with a focus on rights of recognition, employment protections, and healthcare and insurance coverage issues. Young received a JD from Columbia Law School and worked closely there with Professor Crenshaw. After graduation, he served as a postdoctoral scholar and research director of the Columbia Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies. Young then served as director of impact litigation at the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund and is now in private practice. And through Young's work, we can see the ways that intersectional analysis and legal theory have helped to open new horizons in civil rights law. Finally, Devon Carbado is Associate Vice Chancellor of Bruin X for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and the Honorable Harry Pregerson Professor of Law at UCLA School of Law. Professor Carbado's scholarship is in the areas of employment discrimination, criminal procedure, constitutional law, and identity. He's the author of many books, including most recently Acting White, Rethinking Race in Post-Racial America. And Professor Carbado's current work examines race, law, and police violence, particularly through an interrogation of the jurisprudence and possibilities of the Fourth Amendment. And Devon is going to help us think about the relationship between intersectionality and critical race theory. And finally, Kim Crenshaw, a professor of law at UCLA and Columbia. I should note, just by way of introduction, Crenshaw was very early in her career when she wrote Demarginalizing. She'd graduated from Harvard Law School only a few years earlier and had just recently joined the faculty at UCLA. It was a few years before she worked on the legal team representing and supporting Anita Hill during Justice Clarence Thomas's 1991 confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court. Since that time, she co-founded with Luke Harris the African American Policy Forum to highlight the centrality of gender in racial justice discourse. The last thing I'll just say about Crenshaw's body of work is not only is she an award-winning mentor and teacher, she was twice named UCLA Law School's Teacher of the Year, but she's also very much a behind-the-scenes builder of organizations and movements. And to that end, Crenshaw and a very talented team of staff at the African American Policy Forum have pulled together an amazing event in a week's time, which will take place just after our session is over. It's a roundtable titled Reconstructing Our Democracy, a Midterms Postmortem and Call to Action, to help us unpack the current election and what it means. So I just want to mention it's going to be held at the Jimmy Carter Library beginning at 5. There's a free bus which can take you from the hotel, the back of the hotel driveway. It's about a 10-minute ride, and then the bus will return people to the hotel at the end. So we hope to see some of you there. Okay. We've asked each of our panelists to speak for about 10 minutes initially, and then we'll facilitate a few exchanges with them before we open it up to your questions. So thanks very much, and please join me now in welcoming our first panelist, Tricia Rose.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. All right, fantastic. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be invited to share my reflections on the 30th anniversary of Intersectionality, despite the fact that I'm really unhappy that it's been 30 years, Kim. I was like, couldn't it be 15? That would feel a little bit better. And to do so in such distinguished company, both in the panel, on the panel and in the room. But this is not why I've come here today. I've come because it is first and foremost an opportunity to lift up and thank Kimberlé Crenshaw for all that she has done to develop this concept and to retain its political groundedness, to keep fighting, to bring it to the fore in theory and in practice, the lives of Black women and so many silenced, disregarded people. We often wait too long to celebrate each other, and sometimes we miss opportunities to thank those who've been so important, so formative to us. In a profession where critique is the primary mode of appreciation, sometimes expression of gratitude are given short shrift. I'd say most of the time. So I've come here today mainly to thank Kim for all she's done as scholars of race, as Black feminists, as critical race theorists, as critical social justice activists. Her dedication and contributions have been remarkable. Make no mistake, this is challenging and draining work. Work which puts her in various kinds of harm's way, work that encourages hostility from many quarters in and outside academic circles. In what some imagine as the protective walls of ivory towers, it can be an intellectual and emotional bloodbath, especially for disruptive ideas. The norms of scholarly contribution and success often depend on maintaining the obscured power dynamics that an intersectional analysis reveals. This is not an easy location to occupy momentarily, let alone for decades. And in the face of all this, Crenshaw continues to be a consistent beacon of sharp intellect, critical engagement, and courage. She's deployed her considerable gifts in the service of justice for all, but especially for Black women. So thank you, Kim. Intersectionality has been a profoundly generative and influential concept, but it does not materialize out of thin air. It is part of a long tradition of Black women activists and feminists who have attempted to reveal the exclusionary and hierarchical work of single-axis framing. As Crenshaw notes in her seminal 1989 article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, many Black feminists have worked to explain and challenge the particular kind of exclusion and erasures that white feminism and male-centered race work generated. Antecedents include 19th century women Anna Julia Cooper, Mariah Stewart, followed much later on by Angela Davis and Deborah King in the 20th century. As Crenshaw notes, quote, in every generation and in every intellectual sphere and in every political moment, there have been African American women who have articulated the need to think and talk about race through a lens that looks at gender, or to think and talk about feminism through a lens that looks at race. This has been a generative Black feminist legacy forged under frustrating conditions. It is hard to overstate the resilience and consequences of the tendency, quote, to treat race and gender as mutually exclusive categories of experience and analysis. For most of my own career, it has seemed virtually impossible to convince many talented and celebrated white feminists of the crucial import of racial analysis for their feminist work. Over the years, I've attended and spoken on feminist panel after panel, which featured one Black woman whose own work was erased or deeply misunderstood by the relentless white colorblind framing being deployed. Such token participants ended up, myself included, having to do the work of making room for the work. The labor was twofold: to illuminate the invisible workings of whiteness in the feminist analysis and to a perpetually surprised and impenetrable cohort of women colleagues, and then doing the intellectual work that can only be seen after the invisible framing of whiteness is cleared. This work is not over, nor is it limited to the academy. One of my favorite popular expressions of this was captured by a photographer at the first post-Trump election Women's March in January 2017, which showed Angela Peoples, a Black woman carrying a sign that said, "Don't forget, white women voted for Trump." She also was sucking on a lollipop, which I don't think was casual. I think that was allowed her to suck her teeth more intentionally, regularly. Behind her are three white women in what appears to be a relaxed celebration of the heroic and powerful force the Women's March genuinely represented. But they seemed oblivious to the crucial intersectional significance of the reminder Peoples is offering. This reminder is not simply a critique of white women. It forces a more nuanced and racially aware, non-colorblind consideration of the terms on which the Women's March must itself develop. It points to the perils and strength of colorblind, powerblind feminism. It also reveals the double labor still required. Angela Peoples' Women's March celebration is rightly troubled by the question implicit in her reminder: how could approximately half of all white women voters vote for Trump? This is a crucial political question for feminism, and it seems clear that Black feminist analysis in general, and intersectionality in particular, has some helpful and powerful answers. Similar dynamics took place in African American studies and within many Black social movements over the past 30 years. Black feminist challenges to male-dominated African American scholarship and social justice activism was frequently perceived as fracturing challenges to a so-called unified Black community, or the aim of creating a unified community required their absence. The constant refrain in these spaces was the need for racial unity on the presumed heterosexual patriarchal terms and the widely held misperception that anti-sexist Black feminist analysis itself creates racial disunity. In the mid-1990s, when I was just starting out as a junior faculty member, right when intersectionality was picking up steam, I recall a conversation with a senior Black male colleague who was skeptical of the term. I don't think I've ever told you this. Did I? Oh, I'm sure you've heard some version of this. It's like, really? Skepticism? Really? Most of the conversation about intersectionality has faded from my mind because it was a long, well, never mind, conversation. But one thing remains with me. At the end of the conversation, he quipped, "If you stand at an intersection, you'll get run down." Now, this may have been intended as a form of protection, but it felt like a threat. Get in line here beneath the patriarchal Black model, or you might have an accident. Maybe that's just because I'm a New Yorker and I just feel like everything is pretty much a threat. But anyway, the reality was that I was always already at the intersection, and it provided crucial insights. But this has also been a frequent issue in the debates over hip-hop over these decades, of which I've been a central participant, the debates, not in being a rapper. How radical and resistant can hip-hop be given its relentless misogyny against Black women? Does challenging sexism in hip-hop require erasing the violence young Black men face? This is an obvious no from an intersectional perspective. Sexist frameworks deployed to solve real and painful forms of racism cause more harm, and put Black feminists in a bind that intersectionality helps unlock. Intersectionality renders visible obscured hierarchies of power. The both-and framing allows for a better grasp of everyone's multidimensional positionality, complex forms of power and disempowerment, including the gendered and racial forms of vulnerability cis Black men face. One of the central legacies of intersectionality is the room that it has made. It is a way of seeing that opens up space for us to better see ourselves and each other. It attends to concrete struggles over power and social structures and struggles over what identities are here now and what they can become. As Kevin Quashie has noted, quote, "Intersectionality has allowed us to make the name Blackness capacious enough so that its articulation can hold a wide variety of habits of being." It has not destroyed unity among women or Black people, quite the opposite. It's expanded the ways we can inhabit the complex identities that we've been bequeathed and those that we've created. We have needed, and we continue to need, sophisticated and yet accessible and usable ideas like intersectionality that help us think and act in new ways, in ways that expand the language and practice of justice. We need ideas that expand our capacity to envision just relationships to one another. As the world crumbles more quickly around us, this work is both harder to do and yet more urgent. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to open by also recognizing the importance of Kim's work, unlike some of my colleagues. I'm 32, so it is kind of amazing to think about the fact that virtually I haven't known a world without intersectionality. And I think that's important, because it really does shape how folks in these generations are approaching problems, seeing the world, having language to even articulate what's going on and what those interventions are going to be. Though I have had others, make similar quips to me about getting run over in an intersection, so we still have some work to go. So much of my legal work and all of my scholarship draws heavily on intersectionality. There's a good reason for that. Intersectionality is particularly well suited to deconstruct doctrinal distortions in anti-discrimination law that have for many decades relegated transgender Americans to the margins of society. Now, the biggest legal impediment to redressing discrimination that trans folks experience today is the deeply entrenched misconception that broad, remedial, non-discrimination laws don't protect transgender people. Now, for all of the non-lawyers in the room, this is what I mean. We already have laws on the books that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, disability, race, and other statuses. Those laws are designed to be remedial and broad, meaning everyone's protected in those ways. No one's excluded. Well, for far too long, courts have taken the position that trans people aren't protected by those laws because trans people are somehow special and different. Basically, it didn't matter if the victim experienced discrimination or what happened to them. They were simply booted out of court once their trans status was raised. Adding insult to injury, many courts demanded that trans people get special laws to essentially ratify that the old laws do in fact protect them, or else they wouldn't get protection. A more recent example of that is the push for something called the Equality Act at the federal level, something you might have heard of. Of course, when your community is so marginalized that the courthouse doors are slammed in your face, it's pretty safe to assume that you probably don't have enough political power to get the special laws that will recognize that you should have been protected in the first place, right? So what on earth is a trans rights litigator to do in a situation like that? Not enough power to get new laws, and something's messed up in the way courts are looking at laws, so we can't get protection. Well, I argue that this is an area where intersectionality is currently doing a great deal of work. We can use intersectionality to deconstruct those doctrinal distortions in anti-discrimination law. Since my time's limited here today, let's stick narrowly with sex discrimination cases. So I think the first thing intersectionality can do is it can help us diagnose what the problem is with the law. So why is it that some federal courts believe that trans people who experience sex discrimination are not protected by laws that prohibit sex discrimination? What's going on? I submit that they're drawing lines as to what counts as sex discrimination, warping the law to narrowly protect only certain kinds of prototypical victims. So Kim pointed to that exact problem in demarginalizing. That's the issue Black women were facing in those employment cases. Courts there simply couldn't grapple with the fact that Black women were experiencing sex discrimination in a way that was different from the way white women experienced it, let alone experiencing racial discrimination in a way that was different from how Black men were experiencing it. A similar kind of distortion occurs in trans sex discrimination cases. Some courts construe sex discrimination laws narrowly to capture a supposed prototypical victim, very often white women who aren't trans. That kind of line drawing isn't required by our laws. As written, they prohibit discrimination because of sex without caveat. So odd things that you might hear from our current administration, like people should have to prove their sex in court, they should have to undergo genital inspections or genetic testing, let alone other measures, just simply don't make any legal sense. There's nothing in the laws that requires that, and there's most certainly nothing in our doctrine that should require that. Logically, sex discrimination experienced by trans folks should and is already illegal. Well, it's not simply enough to diagnose the problem, right? We have to be able to get courts to understand this, to be able to get juries to understand this, and be able to get the broader public to understand it. So you might be wondering how one goes about fixing doctrinal distortions on the ground. Well, it isn't any easy task, but it can be done. Indeed, I've been doing it for the last few years. As my colleagues will touch on in their remarks, intersectionality can help us deconstruct, and that's what a lot of the academic scholarship focuses on, but it's also generative. In my field, deploying intersectionality makes it possible to present transgender people's cases in ways that overcome and get through legal distortions, correcting them, and also, and I think this is very key, preventing new distortions from being created in the first place. Our goal should be politically intersectional. No one should be cast out of the ambit of protection, right? So I'm going to explain a little bit about what I do using a particular case example, case that's near and dear to my heart and that I am quite proud of. I represent a woman named Rachel Tudor. Rachel is transgender and she's Native American. Rachel transitioned on the job in 2007 while on tenure track at a rural public college in southeast Oklahoma. When Rachel went up for tenure a few years after her transition, the faculty voted for tenure. In the 100-year history of the school, that always meant you got tenure. Well, not for Rachel. A few of the administrators didn't like Rachel's sex and decided to veto tenure in ways that defied the university's rules, and then they fired her, because of course, it's not enough to just deny someone tenure unjustly. I'm not going to get deep into the evidence here, but it does all show that Rachel definitely merited tenure, and there's also pretty damning evidence of the scheme that the administrators concocted to eject her, as well as a pretty shoddy cover-up. Now, like most trans folks, Rachel faced an uphill battle because even though the school knew what they did was wrong, they don't want her to come back unless a court orders it. Now, that's no small task. Tenure cases for everyone are notoriously difficult. And the prevailing wisdom at the time was that a trans woman who was Chickasaw in rural Oklahoma stood absolutely no chance in the courts. But me and my team knew better. We thought we could win because the evidence was good and because we knew that we could deploy an intersectional frame to help fix the distortions, help ride things through. So, to correct the misunderstanding about trans protection, this is what we did. We emphasized the ways in which Rachel is like other women rather than claiming that she's exceptional because she's trans. This move pushed our decision makers, first a judge and then a jury, to see Rachel as someone like the folks they knew were already protected. In every step, we emphasized Rachel's female, not hiding that she is trans, but explaining more or less that the trans label itself doesn't capture all of her. You have to see her as female to truly get who she is. She can be both at the same time. We also emphasize aspects of Rachel's experience at the university that help folks see Rachel did, in fact, experience discrimination in ways many non-trans women do. For example, we talked about the administration's hyper-scrutiny of her makeup, dress, and mannerisms. We also played up the fact that the bad administrators relegated Rachel to special bathrooms far away from her office and classrooms once she transitioned. Now, though we frame this as being an incident of Rachel being the university's first out trans person, we presented it in a way that was designed to connect with folks who have, for different reasons and in different contexts, had what, at least what we told the jury, a Hidden Figures bathroom sort of experience. You know, that hustle to the bathroom where you're relegated to the other side. It's more or less what Rachel endured, unfortunately. Now, I think that was particularly important. It helped people understand and see, put themselves in Rachel's shoes and sort of see the injustice of what was going on. I also believe and have a hunch that it struck a nerve with our judge, who happens to be the first female federal judge in the state of Oklahoma and who entered practice at a time when many law offices didn't hire female lawyers and most courthouses in the state weren't set up to accommodate female judges. Now, we didn't just highlight Rachel's similarities to prototypical victims. That wouldn't have been enough. If we had done that, we would have simply just redrawn the lines in a way that allowed people like Rachel to fit, but also excluded other people. So what did we do? Instead of trying to take differences and say that those particular kinds of differences were what you had to do to prove discrimination, we flipped things a little bit. We used Rachel's differences as a way to inform what remedies Rachel should be given, saying, yes, people are unique. Their positionality is unique, their needs are unique, and that goes into how you heal them, not into how you lock them out of the courthouse. So what did we do, and what sort of things did we look at? Well, we hammered home how devastating it was for Rachel to be denied tenure after working so hard for it for so long. Rachel also spoke directly about what it felt like to transition at the university, to be accepted by her colleagues and students, and then to be ejected by the administration. We also didn't shy away from Rachel being Chickasaw. She shared with the jury and shared with the court that in her tradition, it's a blessing to live as herself, and it would be counter to her traditional religious beliefs for her to try to hide away or shy from that. We also talked about the unique injury she incurred when she was ejected from the university. The university sits on the lands within the historic boundaries of her relocated nation. This was quite literally her land, and they kicked her out. That was a unique injury that we weren't going to shy away from, and we let her explain it in her own terms. Now, ultimately, this is what we did. We invited the court and the jury to intervene, to fix the doctrinal distortions drawn long before anyone had ever seen this case, and find a way to help our laws, as they already exist, help Rachel. We pointed out how the law got messed up, and we helped them see a different way of drawing lines that are more inclusive and, most importantly, faithful to the law itself. And it worked. Rachel's case has broken a lot of new ground. As one example, last November, Rachel won the nation's first federal jury trial for addressing sex discrimination experienced by a trans person in the workplace. The jury's award, $1.165 million for past harm, not future harm, that's separate. And my attorney's fees are also separate, thankfully. Some criticism, so it's a small but significant chunk. But the jury's award is actually one of the largest employment jury verdicts in the state of Oklahoma's history, federal or state court. Now, Rachel's case is ongoing. I wouldn't recommend suing the state of Oklahoma, because they're going to fight this for a very long time. But I do have every faith that our intersectional informed approach will continue to be key to our success down the road. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be on the panel that is looking at the contributions of intersectionality. Kim's work has shaped my own in ways that I would never be able to fully describe. What I thought I might do in the limited time that I have is to contextualize intersectionality as both a product and an articulation of critical race theory, at least as that body of work has emerged in the context of law. To do so, I want to describe in a very, one more time, very conclusory way 7 moves that critical race theorists seek to make vis-a-vis law and legal doctrine A, link those moves to debates about a particular social policy, affirmative action B, and highlight the extent to which those very same moves are normatively and analytically at play in Kim's conception of intersectionality C. So the 7 moves I want to highlight, and again, I'm going to describe them in a very conclusory way, are these. So critical race theorists, 1, seek to demonstrate the extent to which legal doctrine privileges and protects whiteness. 2, highlight precisely how colorblindness functions as a racial ideology across different domains of law. 3, to make plain the subtle and not so subtle ways in which law rearticulates civil rights claims as special rights claims or reverse discrimination or preferences. 4, to illustrate the ways in which courts vigorously scrutinize and are deeply skeptical of civil rights claims, particularly when they're made on behalf of blacks. 5, to expose the racial and gendered ways in which legal doctrine produces legible and illegible juridical subjects, and the extent to which that in turn shapes what kinds of claims are cognizable and what kinds of claims are not. 6, to reveal and contest the impoverished conception of discrimination that underwrites much of anti-discrimination law, to wit, that discrimination derives from particular people engaging in particular acts of intentional discrimination against particular individuals. And 7, to mark a state of continuity between the contestations and logics of race in the juridical arena and the contestations and logics of race in political and social spaces. So let me now give you a sense as to how those 7 moves might be mobilized in the context of affirmative action. This is an important moment for us to be thinking about affirmative action, and then reveal how those very same moves are implicated in Kim's conceptualization of intersectionality. Now, to understand the constitutionality of affirmative action, we have to go back in time to 1978. So to help you get to 1978, just think Donna Summer, for example. Think disco, think the Bee Gees, staying alive, you get the idea. But seriously, think more seriously about the University of California versus Bakke, right? So this is a case in which the Supreme Court is called upon to determine the constitutionality of affirmative action. And Justice Powell's opinion in that case would ultimately become law. So I'll sometimes talk about the court, and I'll sometimes talk about Justice Powell. I'm really just always talking about Justice Powell, but indulge that slippage. So a significant move that Justice Powell makes in this case is this. It says, in order to determine the constitutionality of affirmative action, we must employ the highest level of judicial review, by which I mean we're going to look really hard at the policy to determine whether it's constitutional. The term we use for that in law is strict scrutiny. So we're going to, quote unquote, strictly scrutinize the policy to ascertain whether or not it's constitutional. And by strict scrutiny, we mean to ask 2 big questions. So question 1, is there a compelling justification for the policy? That's one question. If the answer to that is no, then affirmative action is unconstitutional. Everyone get that? So the first question is there a compelling state interest? The second question is, assuming you have a compelling state interest for the policy, are the means chosen to effectuate that interest, quote unquote, narrowly tailored? And that just means, are you overly relying on race? Is race operating in a big way or an itsy-bitsy way? So those are the 2 big questions, compelling justification and narrow tailoring. Everyone still with me? All right, so the university articulated what it thought was a series of compelling justifications. It says, look, we're practicing affirmative action because we want to mitigate societal discrimination. Justice Powell says, not compelling. The university says, we're practicing affirmative action because we want to counteract the underrepresentation of students of color in medical school. Again, Justice Powell says, not compelling. The university says, we want to admit students of color because that will facilitate the delivery of medical services to underserved communities. Again, Justice Powell says no to that. The university then says, what about diversity? Justice Powell says, all right, I'll give you diversity. So that's the compelling piece. So then we move to narrow tailoring. And the question again is, do you have a big use of race or an itsy-bitsy use of race? Justice Powell says you have a big use of race, university. Why? Because you're using a quota. So I'm tempted to ask you all to say quota, 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 quota. It's not a dirty word. It shouldn't be a dirty word. In law, it's a dirty word, so the court declared the affirmative action program in the context of the case unconstitutional. Now, a couple of quick points. One, the Barkey litigation was a loss. Liberals and progressives don't seem to understand that point. Diversity comes into being as a social policy in the context of a loss. And one way to think about that is to do the math. Now, I know that humanities scholars in the context of American studies don't necessarily do math, but the math there is easy. There were more no's in the story that I told than yeses. And there was another no. There was another important no in this case. The university says, look, don't employ strict scrutiny for affirmative action. It's remedial use of race. Reserve strict scrutiny for when you have something like a Jim Crow use of race. That's when you use strict scrutiny. Justice Powell said no to that. We're going to use strict scrutiny for affirmative action. We're going to use strict scrutiny for racial remediation more generally, right? That's what the court does. So how might we now think about the 7 moves that I made earlier to critique Barkey? Well, one, clearly, the court is vigorously scrutinizing the pursuit of racial justice. Indeed, it's employing strict scrutiny to do so. That's easy. Second, the court is instantiating an intentional model of discrimination. From Justice Powell's perspective, it's the intentional use of race. That's what's problematic. We don't care if it's for invidious or benign purposes. It's just the fact that race is being used that disturbs them. 3, at several points in the opinion, Justice Powell makes absolutely clear that affirmative action is a preference, it's reverse discrimination, etc. He says, we'll tolerate it for diversity reasons, but make no mistake, it's special rights for blacks. He's clear on that particular point. 4, the court makes white people, as victims of reverse discrimination, the equality subjects of concern. It's their concerns that drive this particular opinion, and the court renders societal discrimination in 1978 unrecognizable and unrecognized as a matter of constitutional law. In 1978, to borrow from Booker T. Washington, we're just up from Jim Crow. And in this context, still, the court refuses to recognize societal discrimination. 5, underwriting all of this is a commitment to colorblindness, and you should understand colorblindness as a commitment to a racial preference to both ignore or turn a blind eye to racial inequality and to internalize the racial grievances of whites. 6, the preceding 5 move privileges and protects whiteness, and think about my colleague Cheryl Harris's article, Whiteness as Property, and I think you get what I mean to say. And 7, there's a state of continuity between the strict scrutiny regime that I described, a compelling justification and narrow tailoring. There's a state of continuity between that move and the policing of blackness more generally. Now, for some of you, the state of continuity might call to mind Agamben's notion of the state of exception. And I do mean for these 2 concepts to be in conversation with each other. By state of continuity, I mean roughly the extent to which systems and technologies of power are continuous across different boundaries, including boundaries of time, boundaries of place, the public and private, and so forth. To describe states of continuity in this way is to suggest neither the precise and inevitable reproduction of that which has come before, nor the exact manifestation of particular systems and technologies of power across 2 or more domains. Context will always matter and shape where and how power travels and expresses itself. In this respect, the states of continuity that I'm thinking about presupposes moments of rupture, moments of divergence, and moments that we might call states of discontinuity. The states of continuity that I want to put into sharp relief here is between the strict scrutiny context out of which diversity comes into being, and the fact that the black body is always already being strictly scrutinized. We are strictly scrutinized on foot or in our cars, on streets across America, strictly scrutinized entering our homes or apartments, strictly scrutinized eating lunch in college cafeterias, strictly scrutinized in public parks having picnics, strictly scrutinized at work, strictly scrutinized in K through 12 schools, strictly scrutinized at the ballot box, strictly scrutinized in the context of hiring and tenure decisions, strictly scrutinized when we run for office, and strictly scrutinized when we win, particularly when winning means taking the form of President of the United States. Across each of these domains, there needs to be a quote-unquote compelling justification for a black presence. The default is we're not supposed to be there anywhere. And across each of these domains, we're subject to a kind of narrow tailoring surveillance, which is to say we're expected to narrow tailor what we say, narrowly tailor how we say it, narrowly tailor our political commitments, and narrowly tailor the very performance and management of our identities. We're not supposed to over rely on race. We're not supposed to be too racially salient. We're not supposed to be too racially conscious. We're supposed to be, in a way, itsy-bitsy black. We exist in a racial economy in which the body of blackness is always already too much for the fragility of whiteness to bear, to borrow from Robin DiAngelo. Thus, our very being is socially and politically suspect in much the same way that racial remediation in law is always already juridically suspect. This cramped position that we find ourselves in as black people, doctrinally and existentially, is not in tension with the diversity rationale. It is an effect of the racial logics through which that rationale comes into being, constitutionally, politically, and socially. So I want to end by arguing that the 7 techniques that I've described and mobilized against affirmative action are at play in demarginalizing, and here's how. 1, in demarginalizing, Kim demonstrates the intense scrutiny and skepticism that courts show with respect to intersectionality claims. Indeed, as she notes, the courts reject intersectionality claims as per se invalid. Second, Kim, in demarginalizing, interrogates the intentional model of discrimination precisely because that intent-centered way of thinking about discrimination is doing work in the case that she describes. According to Kim, the problem she is interrogating, quote, reflects an uncritical and disturbing acceptance of dominant ways of thinking about discrimination. Consider first the definition of discrimination that seems to be operative in anti-discrimination law. Discrimination which is wrongful, she says, proceeds from the identification of a specific class or category. Either a discriminator intentionally identifies this category, or a process is adopted which somehow disadvantages all members of this category. Our point again is that the problem of intent figures in the intersectional space that she is interrogating. Third, Kim reveals how the preference framing of racial remediation is implicated in her analysis. So in several of the cases she describes, courts refer to black women seeking to have their claims heard as interested in a quote-unquote super remedy, or courts suggest that these black women are interested in having quote-unquote greater standing than, for example, black men, or courts refer to them as wanting a quote-unquote special status. So you can see the language of preference doing work in the cases that she describes as well. 4, Kim highlights in her piece the role law plays producing illegible and illegible subjects. It's precisely because black women are illegible as juridical subjects that their claims of discrimination are not cognizable. So this problem too, demarginalizing puts into sharp relief. 5, Kim demonstrates how color blindness and gender blindness is implicated in the analysis. The court refuses to look at the ways in which race shapes gender and gender shapes race, and in this respect is failing to see the racial implications of the race and gender co-constitutive relations that shape how one might think about intersectionality. 6, her analysis reveals how whiteness is being privileged throughout. Whiteness is at the core of what it is that Kim is interrogating, and part of her analysis explicitly links up intersectionality to affirmative action. She writes, quote, interestingly, no case has been discovered in which a court denied a white male's attempt to bring a reverse discrimination case on the grounds that he's seeking to protect his whiteness and his maleness. So when white men say, hey, I'm discriminated against as white men, we don't understand that as a compound moment. We don't understand it as an intersectional moment, and we should. Kim's point is that white men who make reverse discrimination claims are in no better position than black women who say, pay attention to my race and gender, yet courts do not treat those two moments as precisely the same. Finally, Kim too marks a state of continuity in her analysis. I pointed to the state of continuity between the way in which the law treats racial mediation as suspect and the way in which we treat the black body as suspect. Kim's point is that the position that black women occupy in law as illegible juridical subjects is continuous with the way they figure in anti-racist practices and feminist practices as well. So to conclude, I think it's really important that we think about intersectionality vis-a-vis its genealogy in black feminism. I think it's really critical that we think about intersectionality and its relationship to interlocking systems of power and social categories. But I also think it's crucial that we understand intersectionality as a product and an articulation of critical race theory. I don't think the literature on intersectionality thus far has taken this dimension of the theory seriously. Thus my effort in putting it into sharp relief here. Thank you very much.
So this is why I ride with a posse everywhere I go. So I'm extraordinarily delighted to be part of this conversation and to engage with these wonderful commentators, all of whom taught me a lot about many things, but especially about intersectionality. They each exemplify the best of the tradition of scholar activism, and I'm honored to be in dialogue with all of them. So we revisit this conversation in the context of rapidly deteriorating political environmental hazards, a moment in which authoritarianism, the destabilization of old and new democracies, dramatic increases in political violence, rapid acceleration of the concentration of global wealth, all bring to us unimaginables every day. So this constantly shifting present-day environment has also brought new debates about intersectionality into the arena, one in which there's some interesting appearances of what might appear to be new ideas. One would be the appearance of the intersectionalists. Who are they, right? There is also, from the liberal quarter, the introduction of a new victim of intersectionality, namely democracy itself. And finally, from quarters that are somewhat more familiar to us, there is the introduction of a new asymmetry in intersectionality, namely the idea of intersectionality as a clear intervention and critique against feminism, but a considerably more muted conversation about intersectionality as a critique of modern anti-racism and, by extension, other identity-cognizant politics. So I want to provide just 3 quick snapshots of these sites and paint in very, very broad strokes some responses to each of these sites that I think attempt to unpack ideas about intersectionality that in some ways have been lost in translation towards a refreshment of intersectional moves. Now, I also want to contextualize this in the context of a here and now that's less about this historical moment and more about a my moment. The my moment is the 30th anniversary publication of some of my articles on intersectionality. This being the 30th year, it was sort of a good idea to try to figure out how to put them all together. That in turn sort of raised the question, why am I talking about 30-year-old ideas and articles? How can I make it interesting to a new audience? At the same time, there are also expectations about how, if such a project were to unfold, how it should unfold. So there have been demands that intersectionality be defined and refined, defended and disciplined, standardized and groomed, all for proper presentation. I've tried to resist that, and I've also tried to resist other dichotomies. I call that about is, ain't. It is, but not only. So it is about identity. But it's not only about identity. It is a product of Black feminist thinking, but it's not just about Black women. It reflects encounters with the law, but it speaks far beyond juridical categories. It engages histories, particularly the parallel moments against racism and patriarchy in the United States. But it is neither limited to those specific movements nor to the North American historical context. It's grounded in the urgency of mapping and contesting power, but it also finds inadvertent expression in the rhetorics of those who seek to hold power, defenders of the status quo who mobilize straight white male identities as purported victims of intersectionality. So my is ain't only approach underwrites my effort to ground these articles in the context and the political discourses that they reflect, while at the same time reflecting on the various voices that I re-encountered trying to tell the stories behind these pieces. So the voices that I became reintroduced to were those of a student activist turned young law professor, an Africana studies cum critical legal theorist, an intermittent internationalist, a rabble-rouser, a stubborn critic, and at the end of the day, a storyteller. So some of the essays that I've revisited were rides that I took along with some cherished allies. Some were rides that I took alone. Some were written with a sense of optimism, with a sense of bewilderment, and a few out of utter, complete exasperation. So I think observing the observer is a way to know intersectionality that builds on top of an engagement that focuses more on the doing of intersectionality rather than the defining of intersectionality. Now, that's a position. There are other positions, but that's mine. So in the sense of that, let me offer these 3 moments as an observation that draw on the conceptualization of intersectionality that I'm interested in at this moment. So the anti-intersectionality. So it could be just part of the moment that what's up is down, what's down is up, what's left is right. You know, reality, history have been turned upside down, and I say that knowing that each of these ideas is contestable. But still, I think we have a certain idea of what reality looks like, and it's not what we hear coming out of our president's mouth. Sometime last year, I came across a video that purported to tell the reality or define intersectionality. And interestingly, it was framed as a critique against the silencing of straight white men. It was a very slick production. It went on to tell a story about how intersectionality was effectively a gag of straight white men, telling them that because they were straight, white, and male, their opinions didn't matter, they were valueless in society, they were the new pariah class, right? This is obviously, a discourse of grievance and complaint. Foregrounding this identity seemed to be a pretty odd way to illustrate a framework that had been trashed because of its attentiveness to identity as a discourse of grievance and complaint. So the only difference seemed to be between the subjects of the original intersectionality, their legitimacy, and the subjects of this anti-intersectionality, namely whose difference mattered. Now, I thought that such a transparent critique might have suggested that this far-right place where bare expressions of white male supremacy reign would sort of be the limited terrain in which this critique of intersectionality would roam. But in a moment that reveals the limitless appeal of this rightward drift, I take you back to a moment about 3 weeks ago when Lindsey Graham proclaimed precisely the talking point of this video. I am a straight white male who won't be quiet, he proclaimed from the halls of the Senate, right? So from a far right-wing video to the august halls of the Senate, you have this intersectionality. I about fell out of my chair before the chilling impact of what I just saw came over me. He had fully articulated the baseline of all things that heretofore remained legitimate as long as it stayed packaged in a discourse of objectivity and neutrality, namely colorblind gender blindness. Now, our basic moves among all of us who do a lot of this work against the assumptions of objectivity and neutrality were to reveal that, in fact, these baselines are not that, but they are repositories of power themselves. Graham's embodiment of the far right in this moment reveals how even the erosion of this norm has undercut the liberal articulations of illegitimate power. That's how far this moment has taken us. So to be able to say that any critique is anti-democratic, racist, and sexist because it articulates a critique of racial and gender power reflects that we are in a new moment in insulating this status quo. The fact that wrapping this claim into an intersectional identity barely warranted commentary amplifies an observation made in demarginalizing that Devon has just discussed, that the structure of the argument that courts repudiated when black women were making this claim was exactly the same claim that was made by white men then and that is being made by white men now. This anti-intersectionality claim hasn't been taken up much, and consequently the move to occupy intersectionality in order to destroy it has few antibodies in contemporary intersectionality discourse. So I want to hope that this moment prompts more attentiveness to the ways that intersectionality works from the top. The second moment that I'll say quickly comes from two sources: the responses to the last election and the academic debates called the intersectionality wars. Now, I became aware of the intersectionality wars when I finally got that call from the Chronicle of Higher Education, that wonderful publication that's supposed to stay abreast of new developments. So about 30 years after intersectionality was first published, they decided it was finally time to look at this new development. So I was thinking, the wars, what's that going to be about? I was really ready, because there are a lot of wars that fall under the term, intersectionality wars. So I thought it might be, but it wasn't, about the war to elevate and address state violence against black women or their exclusion from contemporary policy discourse. I thought it could be about the ways that immigration discourse overlooked some of the consequences of status insecurity on women. I thought it could be about the housing crisis, the fact that black men may be locked in, but black women are locked out. Or it could be an interview that would allow us to press some of the data that had emerged from town halls across the country. The fact that, for instance, when it comes to violence, the astronomical rates of sexual violence faced by Native women are so high that the intervention has been framed in terms of not if, but when they experience sexual violence. Or the reports from the Justice Department about Baltimore police abuse of women who are poor or trans or homeless or chemically dependent or involved in sex work. It could have been about the Oklahoma City trial and the conviction of a police officer for raping 8 black women. It could be any of those things. The intersectionality war that he was interested in was none of those things. It wasn't about that. It wasn't even about political intersectionality. It's like how the mainstreaming of marriage equality as the couple next door marginalizes families and people that can't be brought into the couple next door frame with just a little twist. Or how racial justice discourse mysteriously in the age of Obama largely jettisoned the very constituency that was largely responsible for getting him elected. Again, it was none of those things. As it turned out, the point of the interview was a war of surveillance of intersectionality as the vehicle itself, not the issues that it as a vehicle carried into the town square. So this liberal preoccupation with the vehicle rather than the reflection of the subjects in it reflects a similar baseline to the assumptions that underwrote Mark Lila's response to the election, that identity politics was the problem. If identity politics is the problem, intersectionality is the mothership of the problem. To wit, it was too much attention to patriarchy, to homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and white supremacy that has undermined American democracy. Now, my sense here was that part of the problem was there is an expression of nostalgia for a time long ago that by my lights never existed. The so-called good old days when our common identity as Americans held us together before identity politics, before intersectionality. Now, admittedly, those good old days might be hard to find behind all that business of enslaving and segregating black people, colonizing Mexican people, exterminating native people, excluding all Chinese people, denaturalizing South Asians, interning Japanese people, institutionalizing disabled people, criminalizing queer people, domesticating white women, and forging a rapist capitalism off the backs of black women. Now, it's important to recognize all these practices, by the way, were perfectly consistent with the so-called American values and constitutional law. But beyond that, I need to turn the lens backwards to us, because some contribution from the occasional uses of intersectionality that presented as an identity politic without a structural institutional predicate help contribute to the idea that it's just an identity claim. And it's as if when it's heard or read that way, it's identity alone that is being hailed when concrete issues of power are being brought into the conversation. This is often an intentional misreading of intersectionality, but one that our own forces sometimes contribute to when the claims are disconnected from critical discourses about power. My last example. It's more of an absence than a presence, and I've been seeing it lately when intersectional feminism has been claimed as an identity, a stance, along with the line that intersectionality is perhaps one of the most significant contributions of feminism. Now, others have written in response to that claim, but I'm interested to note the asymmetry between that notion and the idea of an intersectional anti-racism. It's almost that doesn't exist. You don't see t-shirts saying I'm an intersectional anti-racist. I think we should, but we don't see it. Now, what I think exists here is the understanding of the place of intersectionality to be largely in the house of feminism. The understanding that the target of the critique being white women allies, and the objective being feminism that's more radicalized, inclusive, and productive. Now, after what happened this week, Lord knows we need more of this. So I don't want anything to be interpreted to suggest that I think that there isn't an intersectional project within feminism as a politic and within women, more broadly. But I also want to say that this location is often an illusion of other sites of intersectionality in politics, particularly anti-racism as a site itself for the intersectional project, in particular an interrogation of the ways that the overall project remains one that is too often non-intersectional. So let me give you my example. As some of you know, we at the Policy Forum were particularly involved in a very pitched battle with the White House over My Brother's Keeper. It was the president's project that framed racial inequity in largely male terms. Now, I want to step back and query the extent to which we tolerate things in the context of race formations that we would never tolerate when it came to feminism or any other kind of ism. My Brother's Keeper is an example. So just imagine a program designed to address any gender disparity that we can think of that explicitly focused and targeted its interventions to white women. Or a family project that explicitly excluded queer families, or a working class project that sought to develop only the skill sets of white men. Civil rights groups across the country would have opposed it without hesitation, but there was considerably more controversy when it came to the exclusion of women of color from a project that was framed as one that was meant to intervene in the context of racial injustice. So this, in my view, is the testament to the fact that intersectionality has an asymmetric relationship between feminism and anti-racism. It's work that is yet to be done. I'll just end with a speculation, something very provocative to say. You know, some people even who are consider themselves deeply progressive and critical might be saying, in this moment, why are we still talking about debates that we had like 2 years ago, which was a lifetime ago, when Trumpism has completely overtaken, you know, this moment. The idea of post-racialism is ancient history. What's the point of actually talking about failed intersectional possibilities? And I want to suggest, just provocatively, it might make sense not to think about this moment as simply a repudiation of what came before, but actually elements of it that built on what came before. How post-racialism constituted a series of denials that told a story about contemporary racial structures as being naturalized. If that's naturalized, then the ability to flip back and actually pursue racial projects is pretty much off the table, and the only question is how to contain the resentment that then gets generated by people who've been told for the last 8 years that we've gotten beyond race. One of the ways that that has been palatable to communities of color is through wrapping it around a patriarchal view of anti-racism that has never been challenged in this contemporary moment as much as the racist view of the history of feminism. So that's a hopefully enormously provocative point, and I'll end there. Thanks.
So rich, so grateful, and so much to talk about now. I wanted to pose and actually get some exchange on the panel before we open it up. And one site we talked about where intersectionality has circulated, in some ways expansive, in some ways limited, is the classroom. Teaching as a site of both interrogating what intersectionality is and then thinking about what its possibilities are. So I was hoping that you might say a little bit about how you've made use of the work in your own teaching or as students, and where you think that might go. I think we'll pass this as well.
Oh, yes, okay, who would like it?
So, well, I mean, so in the context of law schools, quite frankly, it is in some ways both a challenge and not a challenge. So at UCLA, for example, we have a critical race studies program, which is the only such program in any United States law school. So we've created curricular space precisely for these kinds of engagements. So we formally incorporate the understanding of intersectionality in how we think about the curricula, in how we think about ideas about inequality more generally in the courses. So in that sense, it's not a challenge. Vis-a-vis mainstream law school courses, it's a profound challenge. One of the, if you like, epistemic traumas that students encounter is going through first-year law school without a sense of the constitutive role that race has played forming the very doctrines that they're studying. And part of our project has always been to translate translate law in terms of race, by which I mean illustrate the extent to which particular conceptions of law shape race, and the extent to which law itself is productive of race. That is hard work for us to do, in part because, again, the mainstream curriculum elides it. So one part of the curriculum, we can do this relatively easily. Another part of the curriculum, it's decidedly hard.
In the classroom, in my experience, intersectionality has been the most transformative piece of most of the Black feminist courses I've taught over the past 20 years. It's changed dramatically in terms of reception. it was sort of hard to explain. I'd have to draw pictures and intersections and the but for. I'd be like, there'd be someone with their head like just below the ceiling, and then like I would draw a head that made it up, you know. And then it just became something everybody knew. I don't know what happened. There was some kind of intersectionality breeding ground, and like everybody came in intersection, but they didn't quite grasp what it means. And it became much, really, as you said, Kim, completely separate from structural forces and very much about chosen identity politics in the, you know, limited scope of that term. So, you know, it's a more of a struggle. So it went from being sort of illuminating but foreign-ish, right, and feminism, to extremely widely understood but highly misunderstood and protective. People feel a lot of ownership, you know, over what it means and who it is. So it's a useful, you know, in terms of, you know, primarily in terms of Black feminism tool. It's much harder to teach it in the context of historical anti-racist struggles. It's the same issues. It's much, much more difficult. But I do think that's changing intergenerationally. I think Black Lives Matter forward, you know, forces us into a different conversation in the classroom.
Well, so my experience in the classroom is a little bit different. I do regularly lecture at law schools around the country, and I also do sort of practical courses for lawyers who want to know how it is that I'm winning cases that shouldn't be won, basically, right? And I could say a commonality in both sets of spaces, despite, you know, one set of folks being, you know, trained lawyers who are frankly far more experienced than I am at what they're doing, and, you know, law students who often need, you know, basic grounding in the law, is there's simple, just ardent disbelief that what I am doing is intersectionality. Like, sometimes it's quite striking. So Kim brought up, actually right before I did the trial in Oklahoma last year, she invited me to her class to share an article that I wrote as part of one of her books, where I sort of talk about the more theoretical underpinnings of my work, and I sort of lay out in more detail sort of how I think about things and, you know, different particular problems in trans rights jurisprudence. And there was just this ardent, horrible pushback from students who were very excited that I was there, because I'm Latino, I'm trans, and I do civil rights work, and I represent a bunch of folks of color who are trans, and we do like cool things together. That's what they really wanted me to talk about. They didn't want to actually talk about and have me unpack the power structures, how I navigate them, how intersectionality actually just informs things on the ground, not just in theory, which it does, and we all know that, but it actually works on the ground. And there was simple disbelief that it could work. Well, maybe that case was a fluke. Well, maybe this case was a fluke. Maybe, you know, no, but if your client were Native American, then it wouldn't have worked. And I'm like, it says in the paper she's Native American. Like, she is. Like, it was just, and it's very interesting. I could say, I think a lot of it has to do, and Kim touches on it better than all of us, obviously. There's still sort of this idea that intersectionality and what doing intersectionality is must be some kind of narrow type of feminism. It can't be anti-racist work. It can't be, you know, anti-transphobic work. It can't be any of those other things. I think a lot of that is simply just disbelief that, frankly, someone who is steeped in an anti-racist school of thought, as well as, you know, anti-sexist school of thought, could generate such an expansive theory that works in so many different ways and for so many people.
Let me ask you a question. So do you think that their resistance was, I'm interested in you talking about how there was a kind of a socializing support, you know, trans group, trans lawyer, trans issue, like but then when it hits the ground, there's pushback. So what do you think's going on with that? Is it just about identification as opposed to practice? Can you just, because that seems really interesting.
Yeah, and I could say it's truly bizarre, because I'm getting this pushback most strongly from folks of my own generation. So it's baffling. So I don't have the exposure that all of you have. This is my peers. I think it's part of the distortion that Kim was talking about, that there's a certain amount of force on the left, and we do it to our own folks, that understand intersectionality in this very superficial way, and they do not understand how revolutionary it truly is, and what you're trying to get to when you unpack power. You know, what is the point of centering a vulnerable, specific positionality What is the point? Why is that needed in the first place? Why did Kim have to specify black women to unpack what was happening to black women? And how is that, that's important and significant that she centered black women in her own work. It's important and significant that she's, a black woman who decided to do that, but that doesn't mean that the theory is limited in that sort of way. And it's just, Thank you.
So I wanted Ezra to share that story because it's a preface to a couple of observations I wanted to share, and basically both of you have pretty much said it. I think that, so I teach a seminar called Intersectionality. It is basically a workshop, and we bring in practitioners and researchers who are actually doing intersectional work. Students are really excited about it. And at some point I realized what they're excited about is the sense of this is going to be an identity affirmation workshop, right? Like, you're on the right side of history, you're on the right side of all wrongs, right? And to a certain extent, of course, those are the students who are gravitating. But the challenge is figuring out how to take the energy and create dialogues that allow that energy not to be quashed so much, but to be refined into capacity to actually identify the critical dimensions of the disempowerment that they want to be on the right side of, other than just simply say, I am pro this and anti that. And sometimes that's really challenging. So Ezra came, and as he was saying, there were some folks that felt, well, he's not radical enough, right? He's actually on the ground winning cases, you're right, but that's not radical enough. And then I've had other folks who come, and I was able to figure out that there's sort of a performance that people want people called allies to do. And many times that performance is not like really grappling with the ways in which power is articulated and justified. But it's like, we want to see a certain way of performing your being on our side, so that sometimes people were able to come in and perform that, but actually say something really retrograde, and people didn't really pick it up. And other folks come in and they're not doing the, laying down before us, but say something really radical, and so many times that kind of slipped over the students' heads. So a lot of the challenge is figuring out how to do intersectional reading, not intersectional identity affirmation. And so that's sort of a different kind of project that I'm just trying to figure it out now from a lot of trial and error over the last several years.
And maybe one more query to you all before we open it up. So that question of readings, and what kind of readings might be possible now, after the election, after Kavanaugh, in the current moment. So I want to invite you to kind of maybe follow Kim's lead in talking about ways that we might think generatively about the work intersectionality could do for us in the moment, and kind of looking forward.
Too obvious, but I'll just get us going. I think, in the last 2 years, it's been remarkable how consistent and easy it's been to talk about the working class in homogeneous racial terms without saying so. And given how large the non-white working class is, the ways in which it gets completely erased from a class analysis. And it seems like it's a fantastic opportunity for us to push on the hidden racialized project at stake there with an intersectional lens, which does not require that we, take up simply, feminist or identity, as you call it, affirmation work. But you find the same level of resistance. So that to me is, just sort of the grievance culture is, has completely overtaken the ability to talk about class in a multiracial way. I'm not even talking about a gendered way, just a multiracial way, which I know is, in some circles already limiting. But, so that for me is something that I think has a lot of potential in this moment.
No? Okay. So you said Kavanaugh, and I just can't help myself. I felt like one of the things happening, in that Kavanaugh moment, of course, is the failure to learn the lessons from the past. And some part of, thinking about intersectional failure is thinking about it as the repetition of the suppression of intersectionality as it played out politically in moments prior to that moment. So in many ways, we were reintroduced to the way gender got framed on the national stage. And many commentators, particularly, were asking, so this is different from Anita Hill because it doesn't involve race. And I thought, wow, right, people are not really following how this was very much about race, right? So, just to put a point on it, so I think race was playing both a role in the veracity that was given to Dr. Blasey Ford, and the empathy that was given to Kavanaugh. I like Kate Mann's concept of empathy, just brilliant, love it. When I read it, I was like, yes! It's so wonderful what a conceptualization actually allows you to be able to do with it. So, and you were able to see, talk about teachable moments. You were able to see in real time the work race was doing in how people were reading, each of these characters. So when she's first testifying, and when everyone, including Fox TV, said, "Oh boy, they are really in trouble now," I fully think that was like, oh, she's one of ours, right? And we see her as credible, and she's, vulnerable in all the ways that we imagine, a young woman to be vulnerable. There was sort of not much daylight to get a lot of distance between, the veracity of what she was saying and where their politics were. And that lasted for like a half a second. Like the whole country was like, ooh, wow. And then the moment he came in and did the over the top, I knew we were in trouble when he almost cried, because I said, man, if you make a white man cry on the world stage, you're in trouble. And so you could kind of sense whatever existed, particularly among white women, that was empathetic towards her, or a moment of, I kind of recognized that, the story of how they were having fun at her expense. It just rang so true, and I can't believe, given all the statistics that we know, that it wasn't true to a lot of white women. But the other thing that was more true is empathy. The idea that our primary directive is to protect and serve. And that's sort of an intersectional question about how gender issues play out among white people. So I think the failure to see that as intersectional is number one, a problem. And then I'll say the other thing that's really also controversial. In that moment, white women were kind of doing what black women did around Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. They were, getting in line and, encircling the person who has been framed as the primary subject of our concern. Even if, because actually I think a lot of people, it wasn't that they didn't believe Anita Hill. A lot of people believed it. Orlando Patterson believed it. He just said that it was disingenuous of her to break ranks and go tell a story about sexual abuse when all of us know that any black woman worth her salt could have put someone like that in his place. She was just playing to puritanical notions of sexuality that circulate in white elite feminist community. So it's basically saying she's not really, she's like playing one. And because that was seen as disingenuous, he actually made the argument that Clarence Thomas was justified in denying it. So it's like the real liar, even though she was telling the truth, was Anita, and the truth teller was really, Clarence Thomas. And it took years of internal group dialogue to get to, a point where there's a broader sensibility that was a problematic moment. Of course, 1,700 black women took out a New York Times ad, saying that, but it wasn't a widely felt sensibility. So the question for us is, how do we make an argument to capture that these were moments of patriarchal discipline that happened within a broader discourse of race solidarity? While we know that some aspects of race solidarity we do value, right? So it's the same issue that Devon raised. Are we looking at a purely colorblind idea around politics, or can we embrace the idea that there are racial solidarities that are valuable, but the way that patriarchy can function in both of them is similarly critical and problematic?
I'll just add very quickly. One of the interesting things about class is that even when you say white working class, even when you name whiteness in the class, it has currency as a general category, by which I mean white working class becomes working class, and it becomes white working class, and both of those are subject positions we're supposed to care about in ways that elide the working class status of people of color. That's the A part. With respect to the Kavanaugh hearings, what's interesting to me is the extent to which a discourse emerged based on empathy that functionally made the allegation of sexual harassment a kind of reverse sexual harassment. It's like the reverse discrimination claim. So white men became, victims of reverse sexual harassment. That's functionally what was happening in that moment. The third thing I will say is that this era of Trumpism should be a lesson to the democratic machinery which insists on a particular understanding of persuadables. The right understands that the persuadables are your base. Those are the people you need to focus on and energize and engage. We tend to think about persuadables as the wishy-washy middle, a mistake that was reproduced here and seems to be a central feature of democratic politics.
So my comments are less specific about the Kavanaugh moment and more, I think, the organizing and legal moment that we find ourselves in. I think Kim touched upon it well earlier when she stated, when we look at past mistakes in all of our respective movements and collective movements, there's sometimes a hesitance because we're an upside-down world right now, and it seems like none of those things should matter because, every day is just another trying hell. Well, I think in this moment, perhaps even more so than in past moments, intersectionality becomes even more urgent and even more needed. I think after Trump was elected, we've had lots of conversations in different spaces about what it means to be allies to each other, what it means to understand each other's pains, that, things in very identitarian terms, like, oh, you just don't understand the plight of black trans woman who was born in like the southern part of Florida and has one immigrant parent, something hyper specific, trying to nail down every person that we've left off our little boat. But I think what intersectionality pushes us to do is to really just understand the commonality between the ways in which different structures of power subordinate, the ways in which we continue to do the same damn thing over and over again, and the ways in which we unintentionally divide ourselves. So I would say, I think in this moment, more so than others, intersectionality really just gives us a language to talk to each other. And it's a deep talk. It's not who you are or what you look like or what your experience is. It's how we've structured the world around us. It's how we allow the world around us to be structured. And it's about our, frankly, past failures and current failures to push back and demand something better.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 10 minutes for some of your questions now, and I think we'll just take them right from the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you to all of you, all of you for incredibly eloquent statements, and Kim, thank you for 30 years. So it's a lot. Your provocation that you issued at the end, I was interested because yesterday I went to the Civil Rights Museum here in Atlanta, and it was very hard to see the story of Black women in the civil rights struggle as other than children or wives or so on. They were not present. And so it's clearly a long-standing problem. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about the specific history of, you know, the provocation that you named. It has a history like before intersectionality, right? The making visible Black women in anti-racism has like a really specific history. And I just wondered, thinking about that museum, if you had any thoughts to share about that.
I'll broaden that to some of our distinguished.
Go ahead.
Why don't we take more? And
Okay, yeah, we'll take a couple of more questions from the floor and then stack them together. Thanks.
Mine is not a question. I wanted to take Dr. Rose at her statement that it's important that we express gratitude. And so I want to express gratitude for three different things. One, just generally the theoretical work that's made such an impact and is making such an impact. Two, the deep inspiration that I feel as having intellectual models to follow. And more specifically, maybe more personally, as the father of a trans child, Ezra, I'm deeply, deeply grateful for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, so I really love this panel. Thank you so much. I mean, I think it's real obvious in the ways in which the right wing is now appropriating civil rights discourse in the most, hypocritical ways. It's very clear that, they are exercising power in ways that are dishonest and evil, but I think it's also exposing the false universalism, right, of neutrality and objectivity, that made the sort of cisgender white male the universal subject. And so when Kavanaugh has to appeal to this sense of white male victimhood, for like the one place where they felt most secure in their sense of authority and neutrality, a member of the Supreme Court. And when Trump and Lindsey Graham have to go appealing for votes, right, to a shrinking minority, and then when Brian Kemp has to use apartheid rule, to try to maintain like a minority, hold on power, like these are signs of weakness and crisis, right? And it doesn't mean that however we define our side automatically wins, but I think it means we're in this moment where a lot more is up for grabs than normal because the whole center, the sort of liberal hegemony, I mean liberal meaning center, left, and center right, has been undermined, right? And I like this notion that intersectionality is not necessarily our identity that comprises, a new majority, but is a way of thinking and reading, and approaching how we're going to construct some new majority out of this crisis moment before they construct their new majority that's even worse than the one that exists now. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it.
Great, good. Okay, we'll take one more and then we'll give everyone one more chance to go through. Go ahead.
Thank you again so much for your words, for your literature, for everything I've heard from everybody on this panel. I'm curious as to why we media are obsessed with white women voting against their interests. When in fact, if we understand the framework of white genocide model, they are positioned as white saviors. So how is that, I don't know, is that something to consider as you're talking about not being so concerned with the persuadables? Trying to think through this universe of intersectional politics happening.
Okay, great.
sorry.
Well, I guess I don't know where to start. I've had a.
You can take one or, yeah.
I guess I'll start with the last point, I guess. I mean, it seems to me, part of the part that I think we don't emphasize so much about what intersectionality opens up is the transformative nature of who we can become out of who we've been constructed to be. So for me, that's also about transforming what white womanhood is ultimately going to be about. Because ultimately, these are all categories and identities that we've both been bequeathed and that we choose and don't choose, that get chosen for us, that get manipulated. So part of it is figuring out, how do we transform them? I mean, and because I'm work in African American culture, particularly in popular culture, where these questions of sort of performance of identities as a kind of, life-saving practice, right, means I've got to be more tolerant of things I wouldn't otherwise want to tolerate. So it leaves open, it seems to me, a different way of thinking about the issue that you're referring to. So that piece of intersectionality, I mean, I think we need to spend more time with not so much bringing intersections together and demanding that every piece is made visible up front, but that in thinking that way, there's more capaciousness, more possibility for who we can be.
She always does this to me. I'm forever the junior colleague. I did open that door. Now, what I'll say, just very quickly, the one thing I'll say about the point about the destabilization of whiteness is that it's critical, I think, to always have in mind that whiteness has functioned with specificity and generality at the same time. Always, always, always. So that's what's happening in this moment, and that's why black working class is not a cognizable social position. It's because of the generality of whiteness and the specificity of it as well. The second thing I want to say is that our conversation on this panel, I think, has made clear that identity is a part of intersectionality, but not the story to the core. I'm hoping that we'll think harder about a central insight of intersectionality, which is about questions of representativeness. Who can stand in for a social category as such, and the fact that black women has not been able to do so. And finally, problems of structure. So in the context of law now, we're talking, for example, about something like crimmigration, a term I'm sure you've heard, because we're thinking about the extent to which different regimes collaborate to create certain social realities. If engagements with the carceral state had earlier on taken seriously black women's subject position, we would have understood that a long time ago, by which I mean the welfare state has always been a site through which criminal justice practices have been expressed, particularly with respect to black women. So that representativeness stance, I think, is crucial for us going forward, and I think is a central insight that intersectionality puts on the table. Senior colleague.
Vice Provost. Let me just build on my colleagues' comment. I really resonated with the idea that we're in a moment of weakness and crisis, and sort of say what I know everyone knows. There's a way of telling history in terms of then there was this and there was that, and every moment is equally important, than the next. And we know that not to be true. Sometimes we don't know that we're in one of those moments that's more important than everything that's come recently and everything that will become coming in this future until we're in that future. I think this is a moment where there's potentially more awareness that's happening at the same time, that this is 1877 all over again. This is, 1930s. I mean, we have the wherewithal to be able to read this moment against other templates in time that tell us something, that could tell us something. I think the question is what gets in the way of us fully taking into account what's legible and then acting on it. And I'll confess myself, I think some of the things that get in the way are like, it can't go that badly. and then a week happens and it does, right? And so to be able to, sort of maintain a sense of righteous indignation while, politically and materially things are happening that kind of undermine the shock about being indignant, right? Because now we have a sense that really there aren't many constraints. All the stuff that we thought, it's clearly not there. It's just not there. So I'm trying to practice. I want to hold on to being shocked, while at the same time not being unable to move against the shock, right? I want to have that kind of energy that pushes you forward. And then I want to be able to apply that to, sort of moments we're in and allies that we're a part of. So I think right now, and now I'm about to do a plug for what we're going to do in about an hour. I think right now there's this conflict between being relieved on one hand, that there really is some governmental body that can stand in as a check for the things that are going to undermine even their interests. And so there's somebody in the room that has a little bit more power to stop some of this stuff. And at the same time, being deeply concerned about what we saw here, like what we saw right here, in Georgia. And the fact that one would want those folks who now run, the House of Representatives to be far more up in arms about what happened here than I feel that they are. This kind of feels to me like Gore all over again. Like Gore had a couple of arguments that he could have made. He did not want to make the race argument. He did not want to say, like 10 times the number of black people were disenfranchised than the ones representing these daggone hanging chads. And he went to the mat on the hanging chads and refused to make, even in response to Maxine Waters and all the black women who marched over and said, we've got your back, do not, concede this. And I think the desire to still be part of, the legitimate whatever made him not take the argument that was seen by his elite group as that's the loser's argument. And I worry at this moment that if the Democrats don't respond in the fullest force that they need to against this replaying of, 19th century forms of disenfranchisement, that creates a license. It's kind of, this isn't the worst thing that can happen. And I think it is among the worst things that can happen. So I'm seeing this as a crisis for us over here. Whether a critical ability to identify the ways in which their failure to stand up to this gives license to racism, as opposed to the, glass half empty, half full, let's embrace what we've got and kind of be happy about it and move on from there.
I'll make a very brief comment. One of my worries about the current era is that we are seeing things at the same time, we are talking about things at the same time, but I think there's a deep-seated desire to want to pretend that things were so much better, or at least slightly better before Trump, when that is simply not true for the vast majority of Americans. And I'll situate my comments specifically talking about trans folks, because this is the work I do. Many of the things that the Trump administration has been skewered for doing, rightfully so, were actually exactly that way under the Obama administrations. Like the trans military ban, that had been in existence for all time until the last year of the Obama administration, and he slow played the rollout and didn't implement it quickly enough, and that allowed Trump to do what he did. The debates we're having right now about sex discrimination, who's protected, who's not protected, these are age-old debates in American law. We've gotten traction over the years, but the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, yes, the Bush administrations, they all played a role in that. So I think, again, this is a moment where we need to look back in time historically. We need to see what we did, why we were complicit in those things before, take ownership over the complicitness, start unpacking things, and start simply committing to not doing it again, to recognizing where the structures were erected, why they were erected, and why they were so tantalizing in the first place to buy into.
So before I ask you to join me in expressing our deep and profound gratitude to the panelists, I just want to quickly remind you again, if your appetite has been whet about more discussions about the election, a bus is leaving at 4:15 to take people from the conference to the Carter Library, about 10 minutes away, where we'll have this discussion about the midterms, Nikhil Singh, Robin Kelly, Brittany Cooper, a wonderful set of organizers, and food and a reception. And to be on the lookout next year, the African American Policy Forum, whose website you should definitely check out, will be unrolling a series of events to kind of build on our discussion about the 30th anniversary of intersectionality, and that'll include a forthcoming volume that collects Kim's writings together. And podcasts, and a brand new podcast whose first episode is up featuring Barbara Arwine in the back. Okay, thank you so much for everything.